Prologue. The Kingdom of Avilon. The Kingdom of the West, Avilon, once the heart of a thriving realm where prosperity reigned and light illuminated every corner, now stands as the last bastion of hope in a world ravaged by darkness. The war has been long, brutal, and unforgiving. What began as mere whispers of shadows creeping at the edges of civilization soon gave way to the rise of unspeakable horrors: orcs, goblins, death knights, demons and archdemons, all bound to a malevolent force known only as the Darkness. The Darkness, a power as old as time itself, had lain dormant for eons. Its awakening brought with it tides of corruption and terror, sweeping across the land like an unstoppable plague. One by one, the kingdoms of men, elves, and dwarves fell, their great cities reduced to ruin, their people slaughtered or enslaved. The skies darkened with storms born from unholy magic, and the rivers ran red with blood. Only Avilon stands defiant against the encroaching night. A beacon of light amidst the endless shadows, its towering walls and vigilant armies have held firm against the onslaught. Led by the wise and battle-hardened King Eamon, the knights of Avilon fight with a fury born of desperation, their valor matched only by the ferocity of the enemies they face. Yet even as the forces of darkness close in, hope flickers in the hearts of Avalon's people. They speak in hushed tones of a legend, a warrior of unparalleled strength who once long ago turned the tide of a war, much like this one. His name is lost to time, but his deeds remain, tales of a knight who shattered the armies of the Dark Lords with his bare hands, his might unmatched by any mortal. This warrior, it is said, will rise again when the world needs him most. The prophets whisper that the time is near. The darkness, though powerful, is not without fear. For they remember him, the godlike man who defied them before, the man who will return to end them once and for all. As the forces of the darkness gather for one final, devastating assault, Avilon stands on the brink of annihilation. The war has cost the kingdom much, thousands of brave souls have perished, and the lands beyond the walls are nothing more than desolate wastelands. But the people of Avilon still look to the horizon, awaiting the return of their champion, the one who will bring an end to the darkness. And in the deepest shadows a name echoes: Val'Rain. The world trembles, for the darkness knows its reckoning is at hand. Chapter 1. The Weight of the Crown. The early morning light crept over the towering walls of Avilon, casting long shadows across the capital city. The once bustling streets were now eerily quiet, save for the distant clank of armor and the low murmur of soldiers preparing for yet another day of war. It had been years since the sun truly warmed this land. The skies, once clear and blue, were now veiled by a permanent shroud of gray clouds that seemed to grow darker with each passing day. King Eamon stood at the balcony of the high keep, his weary eyes scanning the horizon. His once golden hair, now streaked with gray, blew lightly in the cold breeze. Every breath he took felt heavier, every decision weighed with the fate of his kingdom. Avilon, the last beacon of light in a world overcome by darkness, stood on the brink of collapse. "My lord," came a voice from behind him, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Sir Davos, his most trusted knight and commander of the Avalon Guard. The man's armor gleamed in the dim light, though his face betrayed the exhaustion of years spent fighting a seemingly endless war. "Have the scouts returned?" Eamon asked, his voice calm but laced with an underlying tension. "They have," Sir Davos replied, stepping forward to stand beside his king. "And the news is grim. The Dark Army grows stronger by the day. Orcs, goblins, and death knights have been seen massing just beyond the Deadlands. We expect their assault to begin soon." Eamon closed his eyes, fighting back the surge of frustration that threatened to overwhelm him. They had fought these creatures for so long, and yet every day brought fresh horrors. Demons stalked the lands, spreading chaos wherever they went. Villages had fallen, the countryside now a wasteland of ash and ruin. And the people, his people, lived in constant fear of the darkness that crept ever closer. "How many can we muster?" Eamon asked quietly, his gaze still fixed on the distant horizon. "Fewer than we would like," Davos answered, his voice thick with regret. "We've lost too many. Every able-bodied man and woman has taken up arms, but it's not enough. The darkness presses us from all sides." Eamon remained silent, his hands tightening on the stone railing. He had always been a king who led from the front, one who fought alongside his men in battle. But now, with the weight of the crown pressing down on him, he felt more isolated than ever. The council of elders, his advisors, all urged caution, but Eamon knew the time for caution had long passed. "We must hold," the king finally said, his voice resolute. "No matter the cost, we must hold the walls. If Avilon falls, there will be nothing left to stop the darkness from swallowing the world." Davos nodded, though the doubt in his eyes was evident. "We will fight, my lord, until our last breath." As they stood in silence, the soft flutter of wings caught their attention. A raven, black as night, landed on the stone ledge beside them. Its beady eyes gleamed with an unnatural intelligence, and a scroll was tied to its leg. Eamon's stomach tightened at the sight. Ravens bearing messages from the north were rare these days, and rarely brought good news. He untied the scroll and broke the seal, quickly scanning the contents. His face paled as he read the message, his hand trembling slightly as he lowered the parchment. "What is it, my lord?" Davos asked, concern etched across his face. Eamon swallowed hard before speaking. "The darkness has breached the northern realms. They've taken the city of Thalor and massacred its people. Only a handful escaped." Davos cursed under his breath. "Then we truly stand alone." For a moment despair threatened to choke the king, but he pushed it aside. He could not afford weakness, not now. Not when his kingdom needed him the most. "We are not alone," Eamon said, his voice steadying. "There is still hope." Davos looked at him questioningly, but before he could speak, a horn sounded from the city gates below. The king and his knight turned, peering down at the main road leading into Avilon. A group of riders approached, their banners unfamiliar, but at the front of the group was a figure unlike any they had seen before. Tall, impossibly tall, the rider sat upon a midnight black horse that moved with an unnatural grace. Clad in dark armor that glinted beneath the gloomy sky, the man exuded a presence that made the very air around him seem heavier. His cloak billowed behind him like shadows given form, and in his hand he held a massive, battle-scarred sword. Eamon's heart skipped a beat as recognition dawned on him. "Could it be?" Davos whispered, his eyes wide with awe. "It is," Eamon breathed, his voice barely a whisper. Val'Rain, the ancient warrior, had returned, and with him perhaps the power to finally turn the tide of the war. Eamon watched as the godlike man dismounted, his eyes scanning the kingdom before settling on the keep. There was no smile, no joy in his gaze, only a grim determination. The same determination that had once saved the world. "Prepare the men, Davos," the king said, his voice filled with new resolve. "The final battle is upon us." Chapter 2: The Return of the Fortin. The gates of Avilon creaked open slowly, the sound reverberating through the silent streets like an ominous warning. Soldiers lined the walls, their gazes fixed on the massive figure riding through the archway. The wind seemed to die down, as if even nature itself was holding its breath at the arrival of this ancient legend. Val'Rain, the man spoken of in whispered tales around the campfires, rode forward on his black steed. His presence was both imposing and magnetic. The war-hardened veterans of Avalon's army, men who had faced death countless times, now found themselves rooted in place, eyes wide with awe and disbelief. Even the bravest among them, who had faced down Orcs, Goblins, and demons, felt a tremor of uncertainty as they beheld him. They had heard stories of a warrior who once wielded enough strength to turn the tide of battle with his bare hands, a man more myth than reality. But now, as he stood before them, Val'Rain was all too real. As Val'Rain dismounted, his boots thudded heavily against the stone path, each step slow and deliberate. He carried the weight of countless battles and eons of war upon his shoulders, yet his frame stood tall, undiminished by time. His eyes, a piercing, almost unnatural shade of silver, swept across the city. He took in every detail, the crumbling buildings, the fear etched into the faces of the people, and the dark clouds overhead that never seemed to part. Avalon was in its final hours, and Val'Rain knew it. King Eamon and Sir Davos descended the steps of the high keep, both men feeling an unspoken pull toward the man they had only ever read about in the ancient scrolls. The king's heart raced, but he forced himself to remain composed. This was not just any man. This was a legend incarnate, the key to either their salvation or their utter destruction. Val'Rain stopped as the two men approached, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his dark hood. For a long moment silence hung between them, the only sound the rustling of banners in the cold wind. Then, with a voice that seemed to reverberate from deep within the earth, Val'Rain spoke. Avilon stands on the edge of oblivion. His words were not a question but a statement of fact. King Eamon stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back, his regal bearing intact despite the gravity of the moment. It does, the darkness presses us from all sides. We've lost too much already. The armies of men, elves, and dwarves have fallen. Avilon is the last to stand. Val'Rain studied Eamon, his gaze sharp, weighing the king's resolve. And you summoned me, believing I can save what is left. Eamon hesitated for only a moment. The legends speak of you, of a warrior who once stopped the darkness from consuming the world. You are our last hope, Val'Rain. Without you, Avilon will fall, and with it, all of mankind. Val'Rain's face remained impassive, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes, something ancient, something weary. Hope is a fragile thing, King Eamon. It is easily broken. I have seen it shattered before, more times than I care to remember. Sir Davos, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward, his voice filled with an urgency born of desperation. With all due respect, my lord, we have no choice. We've lost countless lives. The Dark Army is at our gates. If you cannot stop them, no one can. Val'Rain turned his gaze to Davos, his silver eyes boring into the knight's soul. For a moment Davos felt as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him, as if Val'Rain could see every battle he had ever fought, every fear he had ever harbored. But instead of backing down, Davos stood tall. He had faced death many times and knew that this might be his final stand. The darkness is not a force to be simply stopped, Val'Rain said, his voice low, but filled with an ancient power. It is eternal, relentless, it does not rest, and it does not tire. It has been defeated before, but only ever for a time. And when it rises again, it is stronger, more hungry. You ask me to save your kingdom, but saving it will only delay the inevitable. Eamon's heart sank at those words. Could it be true? Was all their fighting for nothing? But he straightened, unwilling to give in to despair. Then we will delay it for as long as we can. If Avilon is to fall, let it fall with its people fighting to the very last breath. But if there is a chance that you can stop them, even for a time, then I must ask you to fight with us. Val'Rain was silent for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly he nodded. I will fight, not because I believe this war can be won, but because I know what awaits if I do not. The darkness will consume everything, your kingdom, your people, and the very soul of this world. I have stood against it before, and I will stand against it again. Relief washed over Eamon, though it was tempered by the grim reality of what lay ahead. Then we will stand with you, he said, his voice firm. Val'Rain's gaze shifted to the far distance, where the shadowy tendrils of the Dark Army could already be seen gathering on the horizon. Prepare your men, he said. The darkness is coming, and when it does, there will be no mercy. Without another word, Val'Rain turned and began to walk toward the city's outer gates, his massive form disappearing into the growing shadows. Eamon and Davos watched him go, the weight of the moment pressing down on them like a vice. The legend had returned, but with him came the knowledge that this battle would be unlike any they had faced before. The darkness was not just an enemy to be defeated. It was a force that would consume them all if they faltered. As the sun set and the city of Avilon braced itself for war, one thing became clear. The final battle for the fate of the world had begun, and only Val'Rain stood between them and oblivion. Chapter 3: Whispers in the Dark. Night had fully fallen over Avilon, and with it came an oppressive silence. The once bustling city streets were now abandoned, its citizens huddled within their homes, praying to whatever gods they still believed in for deliverance. The air was thick, not with the usual chill of an autumn night, but with something more sinister, a presence, a weight that settled into the bones and made the heart race in quiet fear. High atop the walls, King Eamon stood with Sir Davos, both men peering into the blackness beyond the torchlit fortifications. The shadows in the distance shifted unnaturally, as if alive, creeping closer with each passing hour. The army of Avilon was assembled, armored and armed, ready to fight for their lives. But even the bravest among them could feel the unspoken dread that clung to the air like fog. The Dark Army was coming, and with it an ancient terror they had no words to describe. "Do you feel it, my lord?" Davos whispered, his eyes never leaving the horizon. Eamon nodded, his face set in a grim mask of determination. "I feel it. The darkness. It's closer than ever before." Davos clenched his jaw, his knuckles white, as he gripped the hilt of his sword. "I've fought many battles, but never like this. This feels different, unnatural." Eamon glanced at his old friend, knowing the night was right. There was something in the air tonight that went beyond the typical fear of battle. It was as if the darkness itself was already inside the city, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike. Before the king could respond, a low, distant rumble echoed through the night. The ground beneath their feet trembled slightly, a tremor that sent uneasy whispers through the ranks of soldiers below. Eamon's heart raced as he strained to see what lay beyond the walls. And then, through the haze of torchlight, he saw them. The Dark Army. It wasn't an army of flesh and blood, at least not entirely. The Orcs and Goblins that led the vanguard were twisted, grotesque forms of what they once were, corrupted by the malevolent force that now drove them. Their eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, their bodies misshapen and grotesque. Behind them marched the Death Knights, towering figures clad in dark armor, their eyes empty voids of darkness, like holes in reality itself. And then came the demons, hulking, twisted beings of flame and shadow, their very presence distorting the air around them. They moved with a terrifying grace, their claws, scraping against the earth, leaving trails of smoldering ash in their wake. Above them archdemons circled the sky like vultures, their leathery wings blotting out the stars. But worst of all was the presence that loomed at the heart of this monstrous horde, a towering figure, shrouded in a cloak of pure shadow. Its face, if it had one, was hidden beneath a hood that seemed to devour the light around it. A chilling aura radiated from the creature, so powerful that even the most hardened warriors of Avilon felt their resolve falter. "The Dark Lord," Eamon whispered, his voice barely audible. He had heard tales of this being, the one who commanded the darkness itself, the ancient evil that had risen to destroy the world. Beside him, Sir Davos tightened his grip on his sword. "By the gods, we are outnumbered 10-1. The king's stomach churned, but he forced the fear down. "It doesn't matter, we fight." Just as Eamon was about to call for the horns to signal the attack, a figure emerged from the shadows near the gate, walking with slow, deliberate steps. It was Val'Rain. The godlike warrior stood in silence for a moment, his silver eyes glowing in the dim light. He gazed out at the approaching army with the same calm indifference he had shown since his arrival. If the sight of the Dark Army disturbed him, he didn't show it. Eamon and Davos hurried down from the wall to meet him at the gates. The king's heart pounded in his chest, but there was also a spark of hope. If anyone could stand against the tide of darkness, it was the man before him. "Val'Rain," Eamon called out as he approached. "The time has come. They are here." Val'Rain turned his gaze to the king, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he said, his voice as calm as ever, "they are." Eamon swallowed hard, searching the warrior's face for any sign of doubt. "Do you think we can stop them?" Val'Rain looked out at the Dark Army once more, his gaze lingering on the figure of the Dark Lord in the distance. "This is not a battle that can be won by steel alone, King Eamon," he said, his voice low. "The darkness feeds on fear, on despair. It grows stronger the more you believe it cannot be defeated." Sir Davos, ever the pragmatist, stepped forward. "Then what must we do? You speak in riddles, Val'Rain. We need more than words." Val'Rain's gaze shifted to Davos, and for the briefest moment a flicker of amusement crossed his face. "Words will not win this battle, no. But neither will charging headfirst into the maw of death. The darkness must be challenged not just with strength, but with will." The warrior turned and began to walk toward the gate. "I will face the Dark Lord," he said, his voice carrying over the walls. "Alone." Eamon and Davos exchanged a look of shock and disbelief. Alone? Eamon exclaimed, hurrying after him. You cannot face him alone. The entire army will be upon you. Val'Rain stopped and turned to face the king, his silver eyes burning with an intensity that made Eamon step back. I am not like your men, King Eamon. The darkness and I are old enemies. It fears me as it should, but I cannot hold it back forever. You and your soldiers must hold the line. Keep the horde from breaching the gates. I will do what must be done. Before either man could protest further, Val'Rain turned and continued his march toward the gate, the heavy iron doors groaning as they opened for him. The warriors of Avilon watched in stunned silence as the ancient warrior strode into the night alone, walking toward the army of darkness that loomed ahead. As Val'Rain disappeared into the gloom, King Eamon's voice broke the silence. Ready the men, we hold the gates until the end. And so, as the torches flickered in the growing wind and the dark army marched ever closer, the warriors of Avilon prepared to fight their final battle. They knew that what lay ahead was almost certain death, but with Val'Rain on the field, they dared to hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they could hold the darkness at bay. But as the whispers in the wind grew louder, carrying with them the promises of death and despair, one thing became certain. The fate of Avilon and the world hung in the balance. Chapter 4 The Abyss Beckons. The iron gates of Avilon clanged shut behind Val'Rain as he stepped out into the darkened wasteland beyond the city walls. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of death and decay. His every footfall was deliberate, the sound of his boots echoing across the barren land as he marched toward the looming army of darkness. Above, the sky churned with unnatural clouds, swirling like a vortex of shadow. The stars, long hidden behind the oppressive gloom, seemed to fade into nothingness. A low guttural growl rolled across the battlefield, the dark army stirring at the sight of its ancient foe walking toward them without fear. Val'Rain's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword. The blade, jagged and worn from centuries of battle, hummed with an eerie energy, as though it sensed the coming carnage. He had faced the darkness before many times in many forms, but tonight it felt different. This time the darkness had come to devour not just men but the very essence of the world. The earth trembled beneath his feet as dark army began to advance. Orcs and Goblins, twisted by the corruption of the Dark Lord, charged forward with guttural roars, their grotesque forms barely recognizable as once living creatures. Behind them, the Death Knights moved with the precision of an ancient, unholy order. Their black armor clanked in rhythm with their skeletal mounts, and their swords glistened with dark magic. Val'Rain continued his slow, deliberate pace, his eyes fixed on the towering figure in the distance, the Dark Lord, cloaked in shadow and malice. The air around him grew colder with every step closer, the very presence of the Dark Lord bending reality itself. He could feel the weight of the creature's gaze, its malevolent will bearing down on him. As the first wave of orcs neared, Val'Rain's grip on his sword tightened, and with a single swift motion he raised the blade. In the blink of an eye he swung it with unimaginable force. A blinding flash of light erupted from the sword, cleaving through the advancing horde like a scythe through wheat. The orcs and goblins, caught in the arc of the strike, were vaporized in an instant, their twisted forms reduced to ash. But the horde did not stop. For every creature that fell, two more took its place, surging toward Val'Rain in a tidal wave of darkness. He met them head-on, his sword a blur of motion as he cut through the ranks of the dark army. Every strike was precise, every movement calculated. His strength was otherworldly, his skill unmatched. But even as he fought, Val'Rain knew this was only a delay. The true battle was yet to come. Inside the walls of Avilon, King Eamon stood atop the battlements, watching the lone figure carve his way through the enemy. The sight of Val'Rain's impossible strength and speed stirred something in the hearts of his men. What had been fear moments ago now turned into hope, however fragile. "We hold the line," Eamon called out to his soldiers, his voice filled with renewed vigor. "For Avilon, for the world." The soldiers, inspired by their king and the sight of Val'Rain's unstoppable fury, raised their weapons and roared in unison. The sound echoed through the city as the defenders of Avilon braced for the inevitable clash with the Dark Army. But as the first wave of orcs and goblins slammed against the walls, Val'Rain knew they were merely a distraction. The true threat, the true darkness, had yet to reveal itself. As he cut down another towering death knight, the ground beneath him began to tremble violently. Val'Rain froze, his senses heightened. The Dark Lord was close. He could feel the oppressive force of its presence, like a storm gathering at the edge of the world. The air itself seemed to crackle with dark energy. And then from the heart of the enemy forces, the Dark Lord stepped forward. Clad in a cloak of shadow that seemed to ripple with malice, the Dark Lord towered above even the largest of its soldiers. Its face was hidden beneath a hood of swirling blackness, its eyes burning like twin embers in a void. The air around it distorted, the sheer weight of its presence warping reality. Val'Rain stopped, his breath steady, his grip on his sword tightening. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he had dreaded for centuries. The Dark Lord, the source of all the corruption, stood before him once again. Val'Rain, the Dark Lord's voice was a hiss like the wind through a graveyard, reverberating through the empty fields. You have returned. Val'Rain did not respond. He simply stared into the void where the Dark Lord's eyes burned, his mind already calculating the battle to come. The last time they had faced each other, the battle had nearly destroyed the world. But that was centuries ago. This time the stakes were higher. This time there was no margin for error. You cannot stop what is coming, the Dark Lord continued, its voice echoing across the battlefield. You delay the inevitable. I am eternal. I am inevitable. Val'Rain lifted his sword, the blade glowing faintly in response to the dark magic swirling around them. His voice was steady, unshaken. You speak of eternity as if you understand it, but I have seen the end of you before. The Dark Lord's cloak billowed, as though stirred by an unseen wind. You are but a man, Val'Rain, a weapon, forged long ago to delay what must be. You are nothing before the tide of darkness. Val'Rain's eyes narrowed, his body tense, prepared for the coming storm. Then let us see if the darkness is as inevitable as you claim. Without another word, Val'Rain charged, his sword gleaming as it cut through the darkened air. The Dark Lord raised its hand, and a blast of pure shadow erupted from its palm, surging toward Val'Rain with terrifying speed. But the ancient warrior did not falter. With a roar that seemed to shake the heavens themselves, he brought his sword crashing down, slicing through the wave of darkness as though it were mist. The two forces collided in a blinding explosion of light and shadow. The very ground beneath them cracked and splintered, shock waves rippling out from the impact. Orcs and goblins were flung aside like leaves in a storm, their twisted bodies disintegrating in the wake of the clash between these two titans. Inside Avilon, the soldiers and citizens alike watched in awe and terror as the battle unfolded. The night sky was alight with flashes of power, and the very earth seemed to groan under the weight of the conflict. But even as hope flickered in their hearts, they knew that the fate of their world rested on the shoulders of one man, Val'Rain. And in that moment, as the abyss beckoned and the darkness threatened to consume all, Val'Rain stood as the last line of defense. The final battle had begun. Chapter 5: The Dance of Light and Shadow. Val'Rain and the Dark Lord clashed with a fury that defied mortal comprehension. The battlefield around them was engulfed in a maelstrom of light and shadow, their strikes shaking the very earth, as if the heavens themselves were watching the duel between these ancient enemies. Val'Rain's sword, a weapon forged in a time long forgotten, sang through the air with every swing, cutting through the tendrils of darkness the Dark Lord sent his way. Each blow was met with a wave of energy so vile, it left the ground scorched and twisted in its wake. For every strike Val'Rain landed, the Dark Lord countered with magic that sought to devour his very soul. The soldiers of Avilon fought valiantly along the walls, holding back the relentless onslaught of orcs, goblins, and demons. The air was filled with the clash of steel, the cries of the dying, and the roar of monstrous beasts. But even as the defenders fought, their eyes were drawn to the center of the battlefield, where Val'Rain and the Dark Lord continued their battle. As they fought, the Dark Lord's voice echoed in the abyss that surrounded them, taunting Val'Rain with every strike. "You are but a relic, Val'Rain," the Dark Lord hissed, its voice like nails scraping against stone. "A fading memory of a time when mortals dared to hope. But hope is gone. It has no place in this world." Val'Rain's silver eyes flashed as he parried another strike, his voice steady, unwavering. "Hope is never gone. It hides in the hearts of those you seek to destroy, and it will rise as it always has." With a roar, Val'Rain brought his sword down in a massive arc, the blade slicing through the air like lightning. The Dark Lord met the strike with its shadowy claw, the force of the collision sending shockwaves across the battlefield. Val'Rain gritted his teeth as the Dark Lord's power pushed against him, the very weight of the darkness threatening to crush him. But Val'Rain did not yield. He could not yield. The world hung in the balance. Chapter 6: The Price of Power. Back within the walls of Avilon, King Eamon watched the battle from atop the battlements, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the tremors beneath his feet as Val'Rain and the Dark Lord's battle shook the earth, their power beyond anything he had ever witnessed. Sir Davos, bloodied and bruised from leading the defense, stood beside the king. "He cannot hold forever, my lord," Davos said grimly, wiping blood from his brow. "The Dark Lord is too powerful." Eamon clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "We must trust in him. He has come to save us, he must." But even as the king spoke, doubt gnawed at him. The Dark Lord was unlike any enemy they had ever faced. Its very presence warped reality, and its armies seemed endless, pouring over the battlefield like a tide of darkness. Despite the bravery of his soldiers, they were being pushed back. The gates of Avilon groaned under the pressure of the assault, and it was only a matter of time before they fell. Suddenly a deafening explosion rocked the walls, and Eamon turned just in time to see one of the watchtowers crumble to dust, engulfed in flames. Demons riding on wings of fire had breached the outer defenses, raining destruction down upon the city. "The gates won't hold," one of the captains shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "We're losing ground." Eamon's heart sank as he watched the flames spread through the city. This was it, the end of Avilon. He had led his people to this moment, and now it seemed all hope was lost. But as he stared into the chaos, a single thought entered his mind, clear as day. Val'Rain. If there was any hope left, it lay with the warrior battling the Dark Lord beyond the walls. Eamon turned to Davos, his face set with determination. "Hold the gates as long as you can. I'm going to Val'Rain." "My lord, you can't," Davos began, but Eamon cut him off with a fierce look. "If this is the end, then I will face it beside him," the king said firmly. "If we are to die, let us die fighting." Without another word, Eamon descended the stairs, pushing through the panicked soldiers and civilians as he made his way toward the main gate. His mind raced as he approached the battlefield, his heart pounding in rhythm with the earth's tremors. Outside the walls, Val'Rain continued to clash with the Dark Lord, his strength faltering under the relentless assault of the shadows. The Dark Lord's magic was ancient, primal, and with every strike it seemed to grow stronger, feeding off the despair that saturated the battlefield. "You cannot win, Val'Rain," the Dark Lord whispered, its voice a sickening echo in Val'Rain's mind. "You fight for a world that has already been lost." Val'Rain's breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled to keep his footing. His once unyielding strength felt like it was slipping away, the weight of centuries of battle finally taking its toll. But even as the darkness pressed against him, he refused to give in. "I fight for those who still believe," Val'Rain growled, his grip tightening on his sword. And with a final surge of strength, he drove the blade forward, piercing through the wall of shadows that surrounded the Dark Lord. The strike landed true, and for the briefest moment the Dark Lord recoiled, its form flickering, as though it was not entirely solid. But as quickly as the strike landed, the Dark Lord surged back, its form shifting, becoming even more monstrous, its laughter echoing across the battlefield. "You cannot kill what is eternal," it hissed, its voice filled with malice. "Your time has come to an end, Val'Rain." Chapter 7: The Light Within. Val'Rain staggered back, his vision blurring as the darkness closed in around him. The Dark Lord loomed above him, its presence suffocating, like a shroud of night descending upon the world. But as he prepared to face the final blow, a voice cut through the shadows, a voice filled with determination, with hope. Val'Rain. King Eamon burst through the smoke and chaos, his sword raised high. The king's armor was battered, his face smeared with ash, but his eyes burned with the fire of defiance. He rushed toward Val'Rain, planting himself between the warrior and the Dark Lord. "Eamon, no!" Val'Rain called, his voice filled with warning. But the king did not waver. "You are not alone," Eamon said, his voice steady. "We fight together." The Dark Lord sneered, its shadowy form swirling around them like a hurricane. "Foolish king, you seek to challenge me. You are nothing before the power of the darkness." Eamon's grip on his sword tightened. "I am a king, I fight for my people, and I will fight until my last breath." The Dark Lord raised its clawed hand, dark energy crackling between its fingers. But before it could strike, something stirred within Val'Rain, something deep, something ancient. A spark of light, long buried beneath centuries of war, ignited within him. The warrior pushed himself to his feet, his silver eyes blazing with a new power. The light within him grew, brightening with every heartbeat, until it radiated outward, dispelling the darkness that surrounded them. The Dark Lord recoiled, its form flickering as the light burned through the shadows. "You are wrong," Val'Rain said, his voice strong, filled with renewed purpose. "The darkness may be eternal, but so is the light." With a roar that shook the heavens, Val'Rain surged forward, his sword glowing with an ethereal light. The Dark Lord lashed out, but it was too late. Val'Rain's blade sliced through the creature's form, the light within him overwhelming the darkness in a blinding explosion of energy. For a moment time seemed to freeze. The battlefield was silent, the air still. And then with a final echoing scream, the Dark Lord shattered into 1,000 fragments of shadow, dissolving into the night. Val'Rain stood in the center of the battlefield, his sword lowered, his chest heaving with the effort of the battle. Around him the dark army began to crumble, their twisted forms disintegrating into ash as the power that had bound them was broken. King Eamon stood beside him, his face filled with awe and relief. "You did it," he breathed. Val'Rain turned to the king, his silver eyes softening. "No," he said quietly, "we did." And as the dawn finally broke over the horizon, casting its golden light across the battlefield, the people of Avilon knew that, at least for now, the darkness had been defeated. But Val'Rain knew, deep in his heart, that this was only the beginning. Chapter 8: The Aftermath and Reward. The dawn brought a silence that was unfamiliar, almost unsettling, to the people of Avilon. The relentless roar of battle, which had been their reality for so long, had finally ceased. As the golden rays of the sun stretched across the scorched earth and the crumbling walls of the city, there was a sense of disbelief. They had won. Against impossible odds, the darkness had been driven back. But victory came at a cost, one that was visible in the rubble of homes, the bodies of the fallen, and the haunted eyes of those who had survived. King Eamon stood at the edge of the battlefield, his armor still battered, his body aching from the fight. Yet there was a weight lifted from his shoulders, a lightness he hadn't felt in years. The darkness had been defeated, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was hope for a future. He glanced toward Val'Rain, who stood at the heart of the battlefield, his sword still glowing faintly with the energy of the battle. The ancient warrior was quiet, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Even in victory, there was no sense of relief in his expression. He had faced the darkness before, and he knew it would rise again. But for now at least the world was safe. Eamon approached him, his voice soft, filled with gratitude. "You've done it, Val'Rain. Without you, none of us would have survived this day." Val'Rain turned to the king, his eyes reflecting the weight of centuries of battle. "The darkness is never truly gone. But we have bought time, time to rebuild, to heal." Eamon nodded, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this was only a reprieve. But it was a reprieve they desperately needed. The people will remember this day for generations. "You've saved us all, Val'Rain, and for that you deserve more than words of thanks." As the two men stood together in the aftermath of war, the survivors of Avilon began to emerge from their homes and shelters. Soldiers and civilians alike looked to their king and the godlike warrior with a mixture of awe and reverence. The city had been ravaged by battle, but the spirit of the people had not been broken. They began to rebuild stone by stone, brick by brick. And though there was mourning for the fallen, there was also celebration for the living. That evening a grand feast was held within the heart of Avilon, a city still marked by the scars of war, but alive with the sound of celebration. The halls of the royal palace were filled with laughter and music, the air thick with the scent of roasting meats and fresh bread. The people of Avalon, weary and wounded, allowed themselves this moment of joy, knowing full well that tomorrow would bring the hard work of rebuilding. King Eamon sat at the head of the grand table, flanked by his advisors and Sir Davos. His eyes, however, were drawn to Val'Rain, who sat quietly at the far end of the hall, away from the raucous celebrations. He had never been one for crowds, his presence more akin to that of a solitary force, a guardian watching over them. As the evening wore on, the king rose from his seat, his eyes locking with Val'Rain's. He raised his goblet high, and the hall fell into silence. To Val'Rain, Eamon began, his voice strong. The warrior who has saved us from the abyss, who stood against the darkness when all seemed lost. We owe him not just our lives, but the future of our children, our kingdom. Let us honor him as he deserves. The hall erupted in cheers, voices shouting Val'Rain's name. But as the crowd turned to raise their cups, Val'Rain remained seated, his expression unreadable. Eamon saw this and made his way through the crowd, reaching Val'Rain's side. "Come," Eamon said quietly, his voice only for the warrior to hear. "There is more than celebration awaiting you." Val'Rain's eyes met the king's, and for the first time in years there was a hint of curiosity. He stood and followed Eamon out of the hall, leaving the noise of the celebration behind. The royal chambers were dimly lit, the flickering of candles casting soft shadows across the luxurious room. The air was thick with the scent of lavender, a stark contrast to the blood and ash of the battlefield. Eamon led Val'Rain inside, his expression more solemn now that they were alone. "You have given more than we can repay, Val'Rain," Eamon said softly, his eyes filled with sincerity. "But there are ways in which we can honor you beyond words and titles." As he spoke, the door to the chamber opened, and two figures stepped inside. They were women, beautiful and regal, their movements graceful as they approached the warrior. Clad in silken robes, their eyes reflected both gratitude and admiration for the man who had saved their kingdom. One of the women, a lady of the court with long flowing hair and soft, inviting eyes, stepped forward, her gaze never leaving Val'Rain's. "You've done more than save us," she whispered, her voice sultry. "You've given us a chance to live, to love, to rebuild. And we would offer you our thanks, in the way only we can." The other woman, equally stunning, moved to Val'Rain's other side, her hand gently resting on his armored arm. "We would share our warmth with you, Val'Rain," she said softly, her breath warm against his skin, "as a reward for all that you've done." Val'Rain's silver eyes flickered between the two women, his expression one of quiet contemplation. He had never sought rewards, least of all those of the flesh. But there was something in their touch, in the way they looked at him, that stirred something deep with him, something long forgotten after centuries of war. The warrior said nothing, but his silence was all the answer they needed. The women guided him toward the grand bed, their hands slipping beneath the straps of his armor, their touch soft and gentle against his scarred skin. They undressed him slowly, reverently, their fingers tracing the hard lines of muscle, the marks of battle that covered his body. As the night wore on, the women gave themselves to Val'Rain, their bodies entwined with his in a dance of passion and desire. It was a reward not of gold or power, but of intimacy, of shared warmth and human connection, a reminder that even a man forged in battle could find solace in the softness of touch. And as the candles flickered low, the world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the warmth of the moment, the quiet peace that came with knowing the darkness had been driven back, if only for a time. For now Val'Rain allowed himself this brief respite, this reward for the countless battles he had fought. But deep within he knew that the shadows would rise again, and when they did he would be ready. Epilogue: The Return to Shadows. The sun rose slowly over the kingdom of Avalon, its golden rays spreading across the city, casting light over the remnants of the war that had nearly destroyed everything. The people, though weary, were alive. Their king had survived, their walls still stood, and for the first time in years they could dare to imagine a future free of the darkness. But as the kingdom began to rebuild, there was one figure whose presence was no longer felt within the walls of Avalon, Val'Rain. In the early hours before dawn, Val'Rain had left the palace, silent the shadows he had so often fought. The people would wake to find their hero gone, no fanfare, no goodbyes. It was his way to slip into legend once more, to vanish from the world until he was needed again. King Eamon, however, had not been caught off guard. He had expected this. He found Val'Rain standing at the edge of the city, where the forest met the craggy hills leading toward the distant peaks known as the Mountains of Death, a place of eternal night where the darkness had first stirred centuries ago. The wind swept through the trees, and the world was still. "You're leaving," Eamon said softly, his voice a mixture of understanding and sorrow. Val'Rain turned, his eyes reflecting the first light of dawn. He stood tall, the weight of centuries still evident in his gaze. "I have done what I came here to do," he replied quietly. "But the darkness is never truly gone, Eamon. You know this." The king nodded, his heart heavy with the truth. "We have bought peace for now." "For now," Val'Rain repeated, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "But the darkness will rise again, stronger, more insidious than before. It will not stop, and when it does return, you must be ready. Your people must be ready." Im clenched his fists, his expression filled with determination. "We will be. You've shown us that we can stand against it." Val'Rain regarded the king for a long moment, his expression softening, if only slightly. "You are a good king, Eamon. You fight for your people, for their future. But understand this, the darkness is not just an enemy you can defeat with swords and armies. It is a force that seeks to devour hope, to corrupt the hearts of men. Your true battle lies within." Eamon's brow furrowed, the weight of Val'Rain's words settling over him. "What must I do?" Val'Rain turned his gaze toward the distant mountains, their peaks shrouded in mist and shadow. "Keep the light alive in your people, in your kingdom. Let them remember that hope is stronger than fear. As long as you can hold on to that, the darkness will never truly win." The king nodded, his resolve firm. "I will not forget your words." A faint smile touched the corner of Val'Rain's mouth, though it was fleeting. "I will return when the time is right, when the world needs me again." Eamon's voice softened, a question lingering in the air. "And until then—" Val'Rain's gaze shifted to the mountains, his voice low and filled with the weight of what was to come. "Until then I will watch. From the shadows, from the mountains, I will wait. The mountains of death still hold secrets, powerful, ancient things that even the darkness fears. It is there that I must go. It is there that I will prepare for what is coming." Eamon followed Val'Rain's gaze, the looming mountains standing as a reminder of the horrors that had once been unleashed upon the world. "Will you ever find peace?" Val'Rain's silver eyes returned to the king, and in them Eamon saw the truth. This warrior, this ancient being, had never known peace. His life was a constant cycle of war, of battles fought in the shadows of history. Peace for Val'Rain was not an option. He was bound to his duty, to the endless fight against the darkness. "Peace is not for me," Val'Rain said quietly. "But it can be for your people, and that is enough." With those final words, Val'Rain turned and began his walk toward the mountains. His towering figure disappeared into the mist, swallowed by the same shadows that had brought him to Avilon in the first place. Eamon watched until the warrior was nothing more than a distant figure on the horizon. He felt a strange emptiness at Val'Rain's departure, as if a part of the kingdom itself had left with him. But there was also a renewed sense of purpose, a belief that as long as they remained vigilant, Avalon could thrive. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, the people of Avalon began their day, unaware that their hero had departed. They would tell stories of Val'Rain for generations, of how the godlike warrior had saved them from the brink of destruction. They would honor him as the one who had stood against the darkness when all hope had faded. But Val'Rain, as he climbed the rocky slopes of the Mountains of Death, did not seek their praise or their thanks. His journey was not over, far from it. The mountains loomed before him vast and unforgiving, their peaks hidden in a veil of eternal shadow. It was a place where few dared to venture, where the ancient powers of the world still slumbered. But it was there, in the heart of the darkness, that Val'Rain would prepare. He would delve deep into the forgotten places of the world, into the secrets that had been lost to time. For he knew with a certainty that few could understand that the darkness would return, and when it did he would be ready. In the silence of the mountains Val'Rain stood alone, the wind howling around him like a distant cry of warning. His eyes scanned the horizon one last time before he disappeared into the shadows. The world was safe for now, but the battle against the darkness was far from over, and Val'Rain, the eternal guardian, would watch over it from the shadows, waiting for the day when the world would need him once more.